"Arrest her. She doesn't belong here." A loud voice from Jane Mitchell, a white woman, shot loud in the air. Soon police sirens blared through the peaceful afternoon air of Maple Grove, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Riverside County. This wasn't a typical emergency call. What happened that day shocked an entire community and changed everything they thought they knew about justice and prejudice. A tiny 7-year-old girl named Betty Williams sat on her bright pink bicycle. Tears streamed down her face. Her small hands held a worn stuffed unicorn named Star. 3 police officers stood around this child. They turned what should have been a safe neighborhood into Betty's nightmare. Behind those officers stood Jane Mitchell, the woman who started this disaster. She crossed her arms and looked satisfied. Jane told the officers, "I told you she doesn't belong in this neighborhood." Her voice was cold and mean. Each word marked Betty as an outsider and a threat. Betty's world fell apart around her. Through her tears, in a tiny broken voice, she whispered words that would haunt everyone. "I want my mommy." This wasn't just a cry for help. This was a desperate plea from a child who didn't understand why adults turned her innocent afternoon into a nightmare. But Jane Mitchell didn't know something. The officers had no idea either. What was about to happen would turn everything upside down and leave everyone speechless. The truth was coming, and it would expose ugly assumptions and show the terrible consequences of judging people by their skin color. If you stand against injustice, subscribe and type justice in the comments. You will definitely get a heartwarming reply from Living Stories. What started this disaster wasn't a criminal activity or dangerous behavior. It wasn't anything that should have involved the police. What started this was something pure and innocent and childlike. When you hear it, you'll understand how wrong everything that followed really was. Let's go back to where it all began, 45 minutes earlier, when 7-year-old Betty Williams was simply being what every child deserved to be: curious, excited, and completely innocent. To understand how this nightmare began, you need to know about 3 people whose lives collided on that fateful afternoon. Their stories will show you exactly how prejudice, assumptions, and bitter hearts can destroy the innocence of a child. Let's start with Betty Williams, the sweetest 7-year-old you could ever imagine. On that morning, Betty wore her favorite purple dress with sparkly unicorn sneakers that lit up when she walked. She was small for her age, with bright, curious eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. Betty was new to Maple Grove, this fancy neighborhood where houses cost more than most people made in 5 years. But Betty wasn't just any ordinary little girl. She loved butterflies and spent hours watching them dance in the garden. She collected pretty rocks and kept them in a special box under her bed. Betty had the biggest dreams you've ever heard from a 7-year-old. She wanted to be a princess scientist who would discover new planets and maybe find butterflies living on them too. The most precious thing Betty owned was her stuffed unicorn named Star. Star wasn't just any toy. This worn, well-loved unicorn was the last gift Betty's daddy gave her before he left for his final military deployment. He never came home. Star held all of Betty's memories of bedtime stories, piggyback rides, and promises that Daddy would always watch over her from heaven. Betty carried Star everywhere because it made her feel like Daddy was still protecting her. Betty was shy but incredibly curious about everything around her. She was excited about making new friends in this new neighborhood. Her mama had worked so hard to give them this fresh start, and Betty wanted to make her proud. Now let me tell you about Betty's mama, Chief Sarah Williams. At 38 years old, Sarah had fought for every single thing she achieved. She was the police chief of Riverside County, one of the most powerful law enforcement positions in the state. But Sarah's path to the top wasn't easy. She was one of only 3 black women to ever hold such a high-ranking position in the county's history. Sarah was a single mother who worked double shifts, sometimes 16 hours a day, to afford their new home in Maple Grove. She chose this neighborhood for one reason: the school district. Sarah wanted Betty to have every opportunity she never had. She wanted her daughter to grow up in a place where she could dream big and feel safe. That morning, Sarah walked Betty to her first day at Maple Grove Elementary. She kissed her daughter goodbye and promised to pick her up after school. Then Sarah left for work early, heading into what would be one of the longest days of her career. She had no idea that while she was fighting for justice in city council meetings, her own daughter would become a victim of the very prejudice Sarah fought against every single day. But there was a third person in this story. Someone whose bitterness and fear would turn an innocent afternoon into a nightmare. Jane Mitchell was 45 years old and lived in the house directly across from the Williams family. Jane called herself the neighborhood watch coordinator, but really, she was just a woman who had lost control of her own life and was desperately trying to control everyone else's. Jane was recently divorced. Her husband left her for a younger woman after 20 years of marriage. She lost her job, her savings, and her sense of worth. The only thing Jane felt she could still control was her neighborhood. She watched every new family that moved in. But when the Williams family arrived 2 weeks earlier, something dark awakened in Jane's heart. For 14 days, Jane watched Sarah and Betty's every move. She timed when they left for work and school. She noted who visited their house. She watched them through her window like a predator stalking prey. Jane was suspicious of everything they did, and she was just waiting for an excuse to act on her prejudice. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear how this innocent day turned into every parent's nightmare, make sure you subscribe right now. Stories like this need to be told because they show us how quickly prejudice can destroy lives. That afternoon started like any other school day, but it would end in a way that changed everyone involved forever. Betty had her first successful day at Maple Grove Elementary. She was nervous at first, but by lunchtime she made a friend named Emma, who loved butterflies just as much as she did. Emma invited Betty to play at recess, and for the first time since moving, Betty felt like she belonged somewhere. When school ended, Betty felt brave and happy. She decided to explore her new neighborhood on her pink bicycle. She wanted to ride around the block and look for pretty rocks, just like Daddy taught her when she was smaller. He used to tell her that every rock had a story, and if she looked close enough, she might find treasures that other people missed. Betty had no idea that across the street, Jane Mitchell was watching her every move through her front window. Jane saw this 7-year-old child and didn't see innocence or curiosity. Jane saw something she feared, something she wanted to stop. And what Jane was about to do would turn Betty's rock hunting adventure into the most terrifying experience of her young life. The stage was set. An innocent child, a protective mother, and a bitter woman whose prejudice was about to explode into something unforgivable. What happened next would shock everyone and prove that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces. Betty rode her pink bicycle slowly around the block, her unicorn sneakers glinting in the afternoon sun. She was looking down at the ground, searching for the special rocks Daddy taught her to find. In her small backpack, she carried the magnifying glass her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, gave her that morning. Mrs. Henderson told Betty it would help her see the beautiful details in nature that most people missed. Betty stopped near the community mailboxes at the end of Maple Street. Something caught her eye. There, half buried in the mulch around the mailbox post, was the most beautiful rock she had ever seen. It was smooth and shiny, with little sparkles that danced in the sunlight. Betty's heart filled with excitement. This was exactly the kind of treasure Daddy told her to look for. She carefully picked up the rock and pulled out her magnifying glass. Through the lens, she could see tiny crystals that looked like diamonds. Betty giggled with pure joy. She imagined Daddy watching her from heaven, proud that she remembered his lessons about finding beauty in unexpected places. She was so absorbed in studying her treasure that she didn't notice the eyes watching her from across the street. Jane Mitchell stood at her front window, peering through the blinds like a predator stalking its prey. She watched Betty examine the rock with her magnifying glass, and Jane's mind immediately went to the darkest possible explanation. Why was this child digging around the mailboxes? Why did she have that magnifying glass? What was she really doing in their neighborhood? Jane had been waiting for this moment for 2 weeks. Ever since the Williams family moved in, she knew they would bring trouble. She just needed proof. And now, watching this little girl casing the neighborhood mailboxes, Jane believed she had found it. Jane marched out of her house with the fury of someone who felt she had been proven right. She crossed the street with heavy, angry steps. Betty was still kneeling by the mailbox, completely lost in wonder at her beautiful rock. She had no idea that danger was coming straight for her. "What are you doing digging around our mailboxes?" Jane's voice cut through the peaceful afternoon like a knife. The words were sharp, mean, and full of suspicion. Betty looked up, startled. She had been so focused on her rock that she didn't hear Jane approaching. Betty's first instinct was to share her excitement. She held up the shiny rock with the biggest smile on her face. "Look what I found. My daddy taught me to look for special rocks. He said, every rock has a story if you look close enough." Betty's voice was pure innocence and joy. She wanted to share her treasure with this adult, the way children do when they find something wonderful. But Jane wasn't interested in childhood wonder. She snatched the rock right out of Betty's small hand. "You're not supposed to be here," Jane said coldly. "Where are your parents? What are you really doing in this neighborhood?" Betty's smile disappeared. She didn't understand why this woman was so angry. She didn't understand why the woman took her special rock. "That's my treasure," Betty said quietly, her voice already shaking. "I found it fair and square. My daddy taught me." "I don't care what your daddy taught you," Jane interrupted. "You don't belong here. This is a good neighborhood. We don't have children running around unsupervised, digging through our property." To understand what drove Jane to this moment, you need to know about the pain that had been eating away at her heart for months. 6 months earlier, Jane's world collapsed. Her husband of 20 years, Robert, came home one evening and told her he was leaving. He was in love with his 28-year-old secretary. He wanted a divorce. He wanted a new life. He didn't want Jane anymore. The divorce destroyed everything Jane thought she knew about herself. Robert got the house they built together. He got their savings. He got their friends. Jane was left with nothing but bitterness and the small house she inherited from her mother. Then she lost her job at the bank where she had worked for 15 years. Budget cuts, they said. But Jane knew the truth. At 45, she was too old, too bitter, too broken to compete with younger employees. The neighborhood became Jane's last source of control. If she couldn't control her marriage or her career, at least she could control who belonged in Maple Grove. When she saw the Williams family moving in, Jane felt her perfect world being threatened again. A black family in their neighborhood meant change. And change was the one thing Jane couldn't handle anymore. Back at the mailboxes, Betty was trying to explain where she lived, but in her nervousness, she mixed up the numbers. "I live at 412 Maple Street," she said, when her address was actually 421 Maple Street. It was an innocent mistake that any 7-year-old might make when scared. But Jane pounced on this mistake like evidence of a crime. "Little girls don't lie unless they're up to something," Jane said with a cruel smile. "First you're digging around our mailboxes, now you're lying about where you live. What are you really doing here?" Betty started to cry. These weren't the angry tears of a guilty child. These were the confused, frightened tears of an innocent little girl who didn't understand why an adult was being so mean to her. Betty remembered her mother's safety rules. Always be polite to adults. If someone scares you, try to find a safe grown-up. Keep your hands where people can see them. Don't argue with adults, even if they're wrong. But Betty was confused. This was her own neighborhood. These should be safe adults. Why was this woman being so scary? Why wouldn't she listen when Betty tried to explain? Jane watched Betty cry and felt no sympathy. Instead, she interpreted those tears as proof of guilt. "Crying won't help you now," Jane said. "I'm going to find out exactly what you're up to." That's when Jane pulled out her phone and started filming. "I'm documenting suspicious activity in our neighborhood," she announced, as if she was doing some kind of public service. Betty saw the phone pointed at her and became even more scared. She didn't understand why this woman was taking pictures of her. Betty tried to get back on her bicycle to ride home, but Jane wasn't done with her interrogation. Jane followed Betty as she attempted to pedal away. But Betty was only 7 years old. Her little legs couldn't pedal fast enough to escape a grown woman walking with purpose. "You're not going anywhere until we figure out what you're really doing here," Jane called out, still filming with her phone. Her voice was getting louder, more aggressive. Other neighbors started to notice the commotion. Betty was crying harder now, panic setting in. In her desperation to get away, she pedaled too fast and lost control of her bicycle. The magnifying glass fell out of her backpack and crashed onto the sidewalk, shattering into pieces. Betty stopped immediately. She got off her bike and knelt down to look at the broken glass. This wasn't just any magnifying glass. Mrs. Henderson had given it to her on her very first day at her new school. It was her first gift from her new teacher, and now it was broken. Betty started sobbing, not just from fear anymore, but from heartbreak. "Now you're destroying property," Jane shouted, still filming. "First you're digging around mailboxes, then you're lying about where you live, now you're breaking things and littering in our neighborhood." Betty tried to pick up the pieces of broken glass, still crying. I'm sorry," she kept saying. "It was an accident. I'll clean it up. Please don't be mad at me." But Jane wasn't interested in apologies. She saw this as more evidence that she was right about this child being trouble. "Don't touch that glass. You're making an even bigger mess." Other neighbors began to notice what was happening. Mrs. Chen, an elderly Asian woman who lived 2 houses down, came out to water her garden. She saw Jane yelling at a crying child and felt something was wrong. But Mrs. Chen was intimidated by Jane's aggressive behavior. Jane had a reputation in the neighborhood for being confrontational, and Mrs. Chen didn't want to get involved in neighborhood drama. Mr. Rodriguez, who lived across the street, also noticed the commotion. He was a kind man with grandchildren of his own, and seeing any child cry bothered him. He started walking toward them, concerned about what was happening. But Jane saw him coming and waved him away. "I have this under control," she called out with authority. "This child doesn't belong here. She's been acting suspiciously, and now she's destroying property." Mr. Rodriguez stopped, unsure what to do. He could see that Betty was just a little girl, and she was clearly terrified. But Jane spoke with such certainty, such authority, that he began to doubt his own instincts. Maybe there was something he didn't understand about the situation. If you're watching this and feeling angry about what Jane did to this innocent child, hit that subscribe button right now. Betty was now sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her stuffed unicorn star to her chest. She was surrounded by broken glass, facing an angry woman with a camera, and she had no idea how to make it stop. She wanted her mommy more than she had ever wanted anything in her entire life. Jane stood over this crying 7-year-old and felt no compassion, no second thoughts, no doubt about what she was doing. In her twisted mind, Betty's tears were proof of guilt. The broken magnifying glass was evidence of destructive behavior. And the fact that Betty couldn't clearly state her address meant she was lying about living in the neighborhood. What Jane was about to do next would turn this confrontation into every parent's worst nightmare. She was about to make a phone call that would bring armed police officers to surround this innocent child. And she was going to lie to make sure those officers treated Betty as a threat instead of a victim. The pieces were falling into place for a disaster that would shock everyone involved and change their lives forever. An innocent child, a bitter woman, and a community that was about to be forced to choose between speaking up for what was right or staying silent in the face of injustice. What Jane Mitchell did next crossed every line of human decency. Standing over a sobbing 7-year-old child, surrounded by broken glass and clutching a stuffed unicorn, Jane pulled out her phone and dialed 911. But this wasn't a call for help. This was a calculated attack designed to weaponize the police against an innocent child. 911. "What's your emergency?" the dispatcher answered. Jane's voice changed completely. Gone was the angry neighborhood bully. Now, she spoke with fake concern and calculated fear. "I need to report a suspicious black child who's been casing houses in our neighborhood," Jane said, deliberately emphasizing Betty's race as if it was evidence of criminal behavior. "Can you describe what you're seeing?" the dispatcher asked. "This child has been tampering with our community mailboxes, using some kind of device to examine them," Jane lied. "She's been destroying property and acting very erratically. I think she might be abandoned or lost. She claims to live here, but she can't give a proper address. I'm concerned she's either been coached to case our neighborhood or she's been abandoned here by adults who are up to no good." Every word Jane spoke was designed to paint Betty as a threat. She described Betty's magnifying glass as a device to make it sound like criminal equipment. She called Betty's innocent rock collecting tampering with mailboxes. She twisted Betty's tears of fear into erratic behavior. And most importantly, Jane made sure to emphasize Betty's race, knowing exactly how that would influence the police response. "What's your location?" the dispatcher asked. "Maple Street in Maple Grove," Jane replied. "This is a good neighborhood. We've never had problems like this before. I think you need to send officers immediately before this situation gets worse." The dispatcher taking this call was Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of the 911 center. As she typed the address into her system, something made her pause. 421 Maple Street. That address looked familiar. Maria pulled up the police department directory, and her heart sank. 421 Maple Street was the home address of Chief Sarah Williams. Maria's mind raced. She was hearing a report about a suspicious black child at the police chief's house. This couldn't be a coincidence. Maria tried to call Chief Williams directly, but there was no answer. She tried again, still nothing. What Maria didn't know was that Chief Williams was sitting in the most important meeting of her career. The city council was discussing police reform initiatives that Sarah had been fighting for all year. New training programs, community outreach, bias awareness, everything Sarah believed would make policing better for everyone. Her phone was on silent because this meeting could determine the future of law enforcement in their county. Sarah sat at that conference table, passionately arguing for policies that would protect innocent people from exactly what was happening to her daughter at that very moment. The irony was heartbreaking. While Sarah fought for justice in that meeting room, her own child was being targeted by the very prejudice Sarah spent her career trying to eliminate. Back on Maple Street, Betty heard Jane talking to someone on the phone, and even at 7 years old, she understood enough to be terrified. Betty had heard the word police come out of Jane's mouth, and in her young mind, police only came for bad people. If the police were coming for her, that meant she must be bad. "I'm not bad," Betty whispered to herself, clutching Star tighter. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just found a pretty rock." But Jane's words had planted seeds of doubt in Betty's mind. Maybe she was bad. Maybe she wasn't supposed to touch that rock. Maybe she wasn't supposed to be in this neighborhood. Maybe Mommy would be angry at her when she found out the police were coming. Betty tried to hide behind a small tree near the mailboxes, as if making herself invisible could make this nightmare go away. She pressed Star against her face and tried to pretend she was somewhere safe. She imagined Daddy's voice telling her everything would be okay. But Daddy wasn't here. Daddy couldn't protect her from this. Mrs. Chen watched this scene unfold from her garden and finally couldn't stay silent anymore. Her maternal instincts overcame her fear of Jane's aggressive behavior. Mrs. Chen put down her watering can and walked slowly toward Betty, her heart breaking for this terrified child. "Little girl, you okay?" Mrs. Chen asked in her broken English, her voice gentle and full of concern. She could see that Betty was scared and crying, and every grandmother instinct in her body told her this child needed help, not police. Betty looked up at Mrs. Chen with tear-filled eyes. Here was an adult who wasn't yelling at her, who wasn't taking pictures of her, who spoke to her with kindness. "I want my mommy," Betty whispered. "Where is mommy?" Mrs. Chen asked softly, kneeling down to Betty's level. "She's at work," Betty said through her tears. "She's the police chief. She helps people. She would make this lady stop being mean to me." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. This child's mother was the police chief? That meant Jane had called the police on the police chief's daughter. Mrs. Chen looked over at Jane, who was still on the phone, still lying to the dispatcher about Betty's behavior. Mr. Rodriguez had also been watching, and seeing Mrs. Chen comfort the child gave him courage to approach. He walked over to Jane just as she was ending her call. "Excuse me," Mr. Rodriguez said politely, "but I've been watching what happened here. That little girl wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just looking at rocks. She's clearly scared and upset." "Maybe we should." Jane cut him off with the fury of someone whose authority was being questioned. "You people don't understand what you're seeing," she snapped. "This child has been acting suspiciously for the last hour. She was tampering with mailboxes, she lied about her address, and she destroyed property. I've called the police because this is obviously a serious situation." "But she's just a little girl," Mr. Rodriguez said, confused by Jane's aggressive response. "She's crying and scared. Maybe we could just help her find her parents instead of—" "You're being naive about the obvious situation here," Jane interrupted again. "Some of us actually care about protecting this neighborhood. Some of us aren't afraid to do what needs to be done when suspicious activity is happening right in front of our faces." Jane's words carried a clear message. She was accusing Mr. Rodriguez and Mrs. Chen of being blind to danger because they showed compassion for Betty. In Jane's twisted mind, anyone who defended Betty was either naive or complicit in whatever imaginary crime she believed was taking place. Betty heard the adults arguing about her and became even more hysterical. She remembered she had her child's smartwatch that mommy gave her for emergencies. With shaking hands, she tried to call her mother, but the watch was designed for simple use, and Betty's tears made it hard to see the screen. "Mommy, help me," Betty said to the watch, not understanding that she hadn't successfully placed the call. "Mommy, please come home. There's a scary lady, and she called the police on me. I didn't do anything bad, I promise. I just found a pretty rock like Daddy taught me." Betty kept talking to the watch as if her mother could hear her, becoming more desperate with each word. "Mommy, I'm scared. I want to come home. I want you to make the scary lady go away. Please, Mommy, please help me." But the watch wasn't connected. Betty's desperate pleas for help were going nowhere. She was completely alone, facing a situation no child should ever have to face. The sound of sirens in the distance made everyone freeze. Jane smiled with satisfaction. Mr. Rodriguez looked worried. Mrs. Chen held Betty's hand tighter. "And Betty?" Betty's world collapsed completely. "The police are coming for me," Betty whispered, her voice filled with absolute terror. "I'm going to jail. I'll never see Mommy again." 3 police cars pulled up to the scene. Out stepped Officer Jackson, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for being thorough and by the book. Officer Miller, a 10-year veteran who prided himself on being tough on crime. And Officer Thompson, a rookie who was still learning how to handle complex situations. These officers had received Jane's 911 call through dispatch. They expected to find a serious situation involving a suspicious child who had been tampering with neighborhood property. They arrived ready to investigate what they believed was potential criminal activity. Officer Jackson approached Jane first. "Are you the caller who reported suspicious activity?" "Yes," Jane said, putting on her most concerned citizen voice. "Thank you for coming so quickly. This child has been acting very strangely, and I was worried about what she might be planning." Officer Miller looked over at Betty, who was now curled up behind the tree, sobbing and clutching her stuffed unicorn. Even to his experienced eyes, this looked like a scared little girl, not a criminal threat. But dispatch had reported suspicious behavior, and Officer Miller knew that criminals came in all ages and appearances. Officer Thompson felt immediately uncomfortable. Her training told her to investigate thoroughly, but her instincts told her something was very wrong about this situation. A 7-year-old child with a stuffed animal didn't match the threat level that dispatch had described. The 3 officers approached Betty, not knowing they were investigating their own police chief's daughter. Jane stood behind them, satisfied that her plan was working. Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez watched helplessly as these armed officers surrounded a crying 7-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong except exist in a neighborhood where someone hated the color of her skin. Betty looked up at the 3 uniformed officers towering over her and whispered the words that would haunt everyone involved. "I want my mommy. Please, I just want my mommy." But her mommy was still sitting in that meeting room, fighting for police reform, completely unaware that her own daughter had become a victim of the very system Sarah was trying to fix. The sirens had stopped, but Betty's nightmare was just beginning. What was about to happen would shock everyone involved and change their lives forever. How would you feel if someone did this to your child? Share your opinion in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories like this. Officer Jackson approached the scene with 15 years of police experience guiding his every step. He had responded to thousands of calls, investigated countless situations, and prided himself on being thorough and professional. But when he saw what was waiting for him on Maple Street, confusion filled his mind. There, curled up behind a small tree, was the tiniest 7-year-old girl he had ever seen. She wore a purple dress and unicorn sneakers, and she clutched a worn stuffed unicorn to her chest like it was her lifeline. This child was sobbing so hard her whole body shook. This was supposed to be the suspicious threat that required 3 police cars? "This is what you called about?" Officer Jackson asked Jane, his voice filled with skepticism. He looked from this terrified little girl to the confident woman who had demanded police response. Something didn't add up. But Jane was ready for his doubt. She had spent the last 20 minutes building her story, and she wasn't going to let logic or compassion destroy her narrative now. "Don't let her innocent appearance fool you," Jane said with the authority of someone who believed her own lies. "I've been watching this situation develop for over an hour. This child was using some kind of device to examine our mailboxes, clearly casing the neighborhood. When I approached her, she couldn't give me a straight answer about where she lives. Then she destroyed property and tried to run away." Officer Miller stepped forward, his 10 years of experience telling him to take all reports seriously, especially when they involved potential criminal activity. He had seen criminals of all ages, and he knew that sometimes the most innocent-looking people were hiding the biggest secrets. "We need to establish what happened here," Officer Miller said in a stern, authoritative tone. His voice was meant to control the situation and get answers. But to 7-year-old Betty, that stern voice sounded like anger. It sounded like the voice of someone who was going to punish her. Betty's crying became worse. She tried to make herself even smaller behind the tree, pressing Star against her face to block out the scary voices. The more the officers talked about investigating her, the more convinced she became that she was in terrible trouble. Officer Thompson hung back, watching this interaction with growing discomfort. She was the newest member of the team, fresh out of the academy, and her training emphasized de-escalation and community policing. Everything about this situation felt wrong to her. The child's terror seemed genuine. Her tears seemed real. And the stuffed unicorn in her arms made Officer Thompson think of her own little niece. But Officer Thompson was just a rookie. She didn't want to question her more experienced partners, especially not in front of civilians. So she stayed quiet and watched as the situation escalated beyond anything that made sense. Jane saw that Officer Miller was taking her seriously, and she doubled down on her performance. "Officers, I know this might look like just a crying child to you, but I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years. I know what belongs here and what doesn't. This child was acting suspicious from the moment I saw her. She was destroying property. She couldn't give straight answers about her address, and when I tried to document her behavior, she became even more erratic." Jane's words were carefully chosen. She appealed to the officers' sense of duty and their training to investigate thoroughly. She made herself sound like a concerned citizen who was only trying to protect her community. And most importantly, she kept emphasizing that Betty didn't belong, that she was an outsider, that she was other. "She claimed to live on this street, but when I asked for her address, she gave me the wrong house number," Jane continued. "That's when I knew she was lying. Children don't make mistakes like that unless they're coached or unless they're not from where they claim to be." Officer Miller nodded, taking notes. Jane's story sounded logical to him. Children who lived in a neighborhood should know their own address. If Betty couldn't give her correct address, maybe there was more to this situation than met the eye. "Little girl," Officer Miller said, approaching Betty with official authority, "we need to ask you some questions. Can you tell us your name and where you live?" Betty looked up at Officer Miller through her tears, and all she saw was a big, scary man in uniform asking her questions like she was in trouble. She tried to answer, but her words came out in broken sobs. My name is Betty," she managed to say. I live over there." She pointed vaguely toward her house, but her hand was shaking so badly it wasn't clear which house she meant. "Can you give us your exact address?" Officer Miller pressed, interpreting her vague pointing as evasiveness. Betty tried to remember, but her mind was clouded with fear. The numbers got mixed up in her head. It's 412? No, wait. 421, I think." Officer Miller exchanged a look with Officer Jackson. Jane was right. This child couldn't give a clear address. That was suspicious behavior that warranted further investigation. But Officer Thompson was watching Betty's face, not just listening to her words. She saw pure terror in this child's eyes. She saw genuine confusion, not criminal intent. This looked like a scared little girl who couldn't think straight because she was overwhelmed with fear. "Maybe we should try a different approach," Officer Thompson suggested quietly to her partners. "She seems really scared. Maybe if we need to follow procedure," Officer Miller cut her off. "If she lives here, she should be able to prove it." More neighbors began gathering as word spread that police cars were on their street. Mrs. Patterson came out of her house to see what was happening. The Johnson family walked over from their evening jog. Mr. Williams from 3 houses down stopped his lawn mowing to watch. Mrs. Chen, who had been comforting Betty, spoke up with courage she didn't know she had. "Officers, please. This little girl, she was just playing. She finds a pretty rock. She looks with magnifying glass. She is not doing anything bad." Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward to support Mrs. Chen. "I saw the whole thing. This child was just being a kid, looking at rocks on the ground. She wasn't tampering with anything. She was just playing." But Jane wasn't going to let the truth destroy her carefully constructed lie. "These people didn't see what I saw," Jane said dismissively. "They don't understand the full scope of what was happening here. This child was clearly engaged in suspicious behavior, and now these neighbors are trying to cover for her because they feel sorry for her." Jane's words carried a clear implication. Anyone who defended Betty was either naive or complicit. Anyone who showed her compassion was failing to see the obvious threat that Jane had identified. The crowd of neighbors grew larger. Some supported Betty, saying they had seen her playing innocently. Others weren't sure what to believe. The pressure mounted on the officers to resolve this situation quickly. Officer Jackson found himself caught between conflicting accounts and a growing crowd of witnesses. His training told him to investigate thoroughly, but his experience told him something was fundamentally wrong about this entire situation. That's when Chief Sarah Williams's phone finally buzzed with an emergency notification. Her meeting was wrapping up, and she turned her phone back on to find 12 missed calls from dispatch. Her heart stopped when she read the alert. Police response requested at 421 Maple Street regarding suspicious juvenile activity. 421 Maple Street. That was her address. That was her home. That was where she had left Betty that morning with promises to pick her up after school. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Was Betty hurt? Was there a break-in? Had something happened to her daughter? Sarah excused herself from the meeting and ran to her car, driving faster than she had ever driven in her life. When Sarah turned onto Maple Street, she saw 3 police cars, flashing lights, and a crowd of neighbors. But what she saw in the center of it all made her heart stop completely. Her 7-year-old daughter sat on the ground, surrounded by police officers, sobbing hysterically and clutching Star like her life depended on it. Betty's face was red and swollen from crying. Her unicorn sneakers were dirty from hiding behind the tree, and she looked more terrified than Sarah had ever seen her. This was every black parent's worst nightmare. This was the scenario that kept Sarah awake at nights, worrying about Betty's safety in a world that often saw black children as threats instead of treasures. And now it was happening to her own daughter, in her own neighborhood, while she had been fighting for police reform that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of injustice. Sarah parked her car and ran toward the scene in her civilian clothes. The officers didn't recognize her immediately because she wasn't in uniform. To them, she looked like another concerned neighbor approaching the situation. "Betty," Sarah called out, her voice filled with desperation and love. "Betty, Mommy's here." Betty's head snapped up at the sound of her mother's voice. Through her tears, she saw the most beautiful sight in the world. Her mommy running toward her with arms outstretched. "Mommy," Betty screamed, jumping up and running toward Sarah as fast as her little legs could carry her. "Mommy, I wasn't bad. I promise I wasn't bad. I just found a pretty rock like Daddy taught me." The 3 officers froze as they watched this reunion. The child they had been investigating, the suspicious threat they had been called to handle, had just run into the arms of a woman who clearly loved her deeply. And the way this woman held the child, the way she kissed her head and whispered comfort into her ear, told them everything they needed to know about who this child really was. "It's okay, baby," Sarah whispered to Betty, holding her daughter tight against her chest. "Mommy's here now. You're safe. You didn't do anything wrong." Officer Jackson approached Sarah cautiously. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you this child's mother?" "Yes," Sarah said, looking up at the officers with eyes full of protective fury. "I'm Chief Sarah Williams, and this is my daughter Betty." The words hit the 3 officers like a physical blow. Chief Williams, their boss, the head of their department, the woman who signed their paychecks and evaluated their performance. They had just spent the last 30 minutes investigating her 7-year-old daughter based on a neighbor's complaint. Officer Thompson felt sick to her stomach. She had watched this innocent child be terrorized by the very system she had sworn to serve and protect. She had stood by while a scared little girl was treated like a criminal threat. Officer Miller's mind reeled as he tried to process what had just happened. He had been stern and authoritative with his chief's daughter. He had treated her like a suspect instead of a victim. He had accepted Jane's story without questioning whether it made sense. Officer Jackson immediately went into damage control mode, but the damage was already done. They had surrounded a 7-year-old child with police cars and treated her like a criminal because a neighbor had called her suspicious. Jane Mitchell stood frozen in absolute horror. The satisfied smile that had been on her face moments earlier was replaced by pure terror. She had called the police on the police chief's daughter. She had lied about the police chief's child. She had weaponized the police against the very person whose mother controlled their entire department. I didn't know," Jane stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She looked suspicious. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I didn't know who she was." But her words sounded hollow and desperate. Everyone could see the truth now. Jane hadn't called the police because Betty was actually doing anything wrong. Jane had called the police because Betty was black, and Jane didn't think black children belonged in her neighborhood. The crowd of neighbors who had gathered now looked at Jane with disgust and shame. They had watched a 7-year-old child be traumatized, and they had let it happen. Some had tried to speak up, but not enough. Not loudly enough. Not soon enough. Sarah looked around at the officers, at Jane, at the crowd of neighbors, and her heart filled with a mixture of rage and heartbreak that threatened to consume her. This was her daughter. This was her baby. And these people had turned Betty's innocent afternoon into a nightmare that would haunt her for years to come. Sarah held her daughter close and made a silent promise that this injustice would not go unanswered. The reckoning that was coming would change everything for everyone involved. Because when you hurt the police chief's child based on nothing but prejudice, you don't just face the consequences of your actions. You face the full weight of a mother's fury and a leader's power to demand justice. The revelation was complete. The truth was exposed. And now everyone would have to face the consequences of what they had done to an innocent 7-year-old girl whose only crime was being black, in a neighborhood where someone decided she didn't belong. Chief Sarah Williams held her daughter close, feeling Betty's tiny body shake against her chest as the sobs slowly began to quiet. But even as Sarah whispered words of comfort to her child, her eyes surveyed the scene with the sharp focus of a law enforcement leader who had just witnessed a catastrophic failure of the system she led. Sarah's voice was calm when she spoke to the officers, but everyone present could feel the controlled fury radiating from every word. "Officers, I want a full report on exactly how my 7-year-old daughter became a suspect in her own neighborhood," she said. Her tone was professional, measured, and absolutely terrifying in its restraint. "I want to understand the chain of decisions that led to 3 police cars responding to a call about a child with a stuffed unicorn." Officer Jackson, Officer Miller, and Officer Thompson stood at attention, knowing their careers hung in the balance. They had just participated in the traumatization of their chief's child, and there would be consequences that reached far beyond this single incident. "Ma'am," Officer Jackson began, "we responded to a call reporting suspicious behavior." "Stop," Chief Williams interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Before you tell me about the call you received, I want to know what you saw when you arrived. When you looked at my daughter, what did you see?" The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had seen a tiny crying child with a stuffed animal. They had seen innocence and terror. But they had allowed Jane's narrative to override their own observations. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, holding the broken pieces of Betty's magnifying glass in her weathered hands. "Chief Williams," she said in her careful English, "your little girl, she was just looking at rocks, like little scientist. She find pretty rock, she used this to look close, she not doing anything bad." Mrs. Chen placed the broken glass in Sarah's free hand, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. This simple educational tool, given to Betty by her teacher to explore the natural world, had been destroyed in the chaos of Jane's false accusations. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward to support Mrs. Chen's account. "Chief Williams, I watched this whole situation unfold from my yard. Your daughter was playing innocently. She found a rock near the mailboxes and was examining it with her magnifying glass. She wasn't tampering with anything or acting suspiciously. Miss Mitchell approached her aggressively and began interrogating her like she was a criminal." The truth was crystal clear now. Betty hadn't been casing houses or destroying property. She had been doing exactly what any curious 7-year-old would do, exploring her world and finding wonder in simple things. Chief Williams looked at her officers with the weight of leadership and disappointment. "This is a teachable moment," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years fighting for better policing. "What happened here today represents everything wrong with how we sometimes approach our communities. Sarah shifted Betty to one arm and addressed her officers directly. You received a call describing suspicious behavior, but when you arrived, you saw a crying child with a toy. Your training should have told you to de-escalate immediately. Instead, you allowed the caller's narrative to influence your approach to a 7-year-old girl. Officer Thompson, the rookie, spoke up with visible emotion. Chief, you're absolutely right. I felt uncomfortable with our approach from the beginning, but I didn't speak up. I'm so sorry. Officer Thompson, Sarah replied, your instincts were correct. In the future, trust them. Part of good policing is recognizing when something doesn't feel right and having the courage to voice those concerns. Chief Williams then made an announcement that would change how their department operated. Effective immediately, we will implement mandatory retraining for all officers on community policing, with special emphasis on interactions involving children. We will also establish new protocols for evaluating calls that may be motivated by racial bias. Betty had been listening to the adult conversation, and she tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mommy, she whispered, I still have my treasure rock. Betty pulled the small, shiny rock from her pocket, the same rock that Jane had snatched away and then dismissed as evidence of suspicious behavior. In Betty's small hand, it looked exactly like what it was, a pretty rock that caught a child's eye. Oh, Betty, Sarah said, her voice filled with love and wonder as she examined the rock. This is beautiful. Look how it catches the light. Daddy would be so proud that you remembered what he taught you about finding treasures. The officers watched this tender moment and finally understood the full scope of what had really happened. They had terrorized a child for collecting rocks. They had treated natural curiosity as criminal behavior. They had allowed prejudice to blind them to innocence. Officer Miller, who had been the most stern with Betty, stepped forward with visible emotion. Chief Williams, Betty, I owe you both an apology. I failed to see what was really happening here, and I'm deeply sorry for my role in causing fear and trauma. Word of what happened spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Parents were horrified to learn that a 7-year-old child had been treated as a criminal threat in their community. The incident forced everyone to examine their own biases and their role in either perpetuating or preventing such injustices. Mrs. Chen, determined to restore some of Betty's joy and discovery, went to the store that very evening and bought a new magnifying glass. The next morning, she knocked on the Williams family's door with a gift bag containing the magnifying glass and a note that read, "For the little scientist. Keep exploring." Mr. Rodriguez was so disturbed by what he witnessed that he organized a neighborhood meeting for that weekend. "We need to talk about what happened and make sure it never happens again," he told everyone he met. "We failed that little girl, and we need to do better." Jane Mitchell faced immediate consequences for her actions. Chief Williams filed charges for filing a false police report, a crime that carried both legal penalties and public shame. The Neighborhood Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Jane from any leadership positions. But Jane's real punishment came from her neighbors. People who had once trusted her judgment now saw her for what she really was, a woman whose prejudice had endangered a child. Jane found herself completely ostracized, avoided by the very community she claimed to protect. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Jane's own prejudice had destroyed her standing in the neighborhood she believed she was safeguarding. Her hatred had turned her neighbors against her more effectively than any outside threat ever could. Chief Williams used this incident as a catalyst for broader reform throughout the police department. She implemented new training programs focused on recognizing racially motivated calls and protecting children from unnecessary police intervention. She established community forums where residents could learn about appropriate use of emergency services. "No child should ever experience what my daughter experienced," Sarah told the city council at their next meeting. "We must do better at recognizing bias, de-escalating situations involving children, and building trust between police and the communities we serve. The most remarkable thing about Betty was her resilience. Despite the trauma she experienced, her spirit wasn't broken. With her mother's love and the community's support rallying around her, Betty continued to collect rocks and explore the world with wonder. Betty's rock collection became something special in the neighborhood. Other children began bringing her interesting rocks they found, and Betty would examine each one with her new magnifying glass, sharing the stories she imagined each rock could tell. Her collection became a symbol of childhood innocence that the community had learned to value and protect. The incident became a turning point for Maple Grove. Families who had previously kept to themselves began organizing playdates and community events. Parents made sure their children understood that all kids belonged in their neighborhood, regardless of what they looked like. Betty, who had been shy about making friends, suddenly found herself surrounded by children who wanted to play with her. Her rock collecting hobby attracted other young explorers, and soon, Betty had the circle of friends her mother had hoped she would find. The neighborhood transformed into the inclusive community that Chief Williams had dreamed of when she moved there. Families looked out for each other's children. Neighbors intervened when they saw unfair treatment. And everyone understood that protecting the innocence and safety of all children was everyone's responsibility. If this story has moved you and made you think about how we treat children in our communities, please subscribe to make sure you see more stories about justice, growth, and positive change. We need to keep sharing these experiences so we can learn from them and do better. 3 months later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Betty sat in her front yard with her rock collection spread out on a blanket. She was using her magnifying glass to show her new friends, Emma, Marcus, and Sophia, the different crystals and patterns she had discovered in each rock. Chief Williams watched from the porch, a cup of coffee in her hands and pride filling her heart. Her daughter had not only survived the trauma of that horrible day, but she had thrived. Betty's joy in discovery had been restored, her sense of wonder had been protected, and her belief in the goodness of people had been renewed by the community that rallied around her. Sarah thought about how this incident had changed everything. Her department's training, her neighborhood's awareness, and her own determination to create a world where no child would ever experience what Betty experienced. As Sarah watched her daughter teach other children about the treasures that could be found in ordinary rocks, she made a silent promise to her late husband and to all the children who deserved better. She would continue fighting for justice, building bridges between communities, and ensuring that every child could explore their world with the same wonder and safety that Betty now enjoyed. The story that began with sirens and tears had transformed into something beautiful. A community united in protecting its children, a police department committed to better training and awareness, and a little girl whose resilience had inspired positive change in everyone around her. Betty looked up from her rock collection and smiled at her mother, her eyes bright with happiness and curiosity. In that smile, Sarah saw hope for the future and proof that love, justice, and community could overcome even the darkest prejudice. The treasure Betty found that day wasn't just a shiny rock. It was the discovery that when good people stand together, they can protect innocence, demand justice, and create a world where every child is valued, respected, and free to explore their universe with wonder and joy. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.